there is a profound, almost sadistic irony woven deeply into the very fabric of human existence. It is the arrogant, desperate illusion that surviving the absolute darkest pits of hell somehow grants us a permanent golden ticket to salvation. We fight, we bleed, we drag our shattered bodies through the smoking ashes of our own catastrophic destruction, and we do so naively convinced that the universe honors our suffering, that the worst of the nightmare is finally permanently behind us. But the cosmos does not operate on the fragile concept of poetic justice. It possesses no empathy for the weary, no political allegiance to the righteous, and absolutely no margin for human exhaustion. Sometimes the most agonizing cruelty of fate is surviving the slaughterhouse, taking that final, trembling step toward the warm threshold of your home, only to have the door violently, permanently slammed shut by the sheer, unadulterated greed of another human being. This is not just a story of a shipwreck. This is the story of the cruelest mathematical joke ever played on the survivors of an apocalypse. The month is April. The year is 1865. The bloodiest, most devastating, and profoundly traumatic chapter in American history, the Civil War, had finally bled itself dry. The fields of a fractured nation were choked with the rotting dead. But for a very specific group of men, the silencing of the cannons meant an awakening from a living nightmare. Deep within the hostile territories of the South lay Andersonville. It was not merely a prisoner of war camp. It was an infamous Confederate death factory, a desolate open-air cage where human life was methodically reduced to starvation, disease, and pure, unfiltered madness. For months, tens of thousands of Union soldiers had been packed into a muddy, disease-ridden pit, drinking from contaminated streams and dying of scurvy and dysentery. Yet, against all biological odds, a fraction of these men managed to endure. In the late spring of 1865, the heavy, rusted iron gates of Andersonville were finally thrown open. Thousands of prisoners were suddenly released back into the world of the living. But these were no longer the proud, upright, marching young men who had bravely left their homes and families years ago. They were quite literally walking skeletons, hollowed out, fragile shells of humanity, barely clinging to the last, fraying threads of biological existence. Their uniforms were nothing but disease-ridden rags clinging to protruding ribs. Their skin was pale, paper-thin, and stretched tightly over fragile skulls. Yet deep within their sunken, hollow eyes, there burned a singular, desperate beacon of hope. It was the intoxicating, overwhelming dream of the North, the warmth of their families, the softness of their own beds, the sanctuary of home. To reach that long-awaited sanctuary, these fragile men had to travel north, navigating the dark, unpredictable, and treacherous arteries of the Mississippi River. And their grand vessel of salvation was chosen. It was the SS Sultana. From the outside, the Sultana was a massive, majestic, wooden sidewheel steamboat, a floating palace of the 19th century, driven by towering smokestacks and deafening coal-fed steam engines. She was a marvel of an increasingly industrialized era, built to effortlessly slice through the muddy, turbulent currents of the mighty Mississippi. But behind her majestic wooden facade, behind the freshly painted rails and the churning paddle wheels, a dark, opportunistic, and fatal economic equation was being calculated in the shadows. The United States government, eager to rapidly empty the southern prison camps and send the heroes home, offered a highly lucrative bounty. They agreed to pay steamboat captains $5 for every enlisted soldier and $10 for every officer transported safely to the North. In the economic depression following the war, this was an astronomical sum of money. It was a highly dangerous financial incentive, one that instantly transformed desperate, traumatized human lives into sheer, quantifiable, and stackable profit. This intoxicating promise of immense wealth completely blinded the master of the Sultana, Captain J. Cass Mason. Mason was a man whose ambition vastly outweighed his moral compass. The blinding allure of government gold erased any lingering trace of nautical logic or human compassion in his mind. Arrogance and insatiable greed swiftly took the helm of the Sultana, entirely replacing the fundamental laws of physics, buoyancy, and maritime safety. By maritime law and engineering standards, the fragile wooden decks and internal structures of the SS Sultana were designed to safely carry a maximum capacity of only 376 passengers. 376 souls. That was the mathematical limit of the wood, the water, and the steam. But to secure a monumental government payout, Captain Mason orchestrated an act of pure, unadulterated madness at the docks of Vicksburg, Mississippi. He did not merely overbook the ship. He weaponized the desperate longing of the soldiers. Knowing these men would endure anything just to get home, Mason ordered the continuous boarding of exactly 2,300 soldiers and civilians, 2,300 human beings, forced onto a fragile wooden vessel built for a mere fraction of that number. This was no longer a passenger transport. It was a ruthless exercise in absolute, suffocating, and terrifying claustrophobia. Every single square inch of the wooden decks, the stairwells, the hallways, and the engine rooms was packed with exhausted, desperate men stacked like cordwood. There was literally no room to step. There was no space to lie down. Men were forced to stand shoulder to shoulder, their emaciated bodies pressed agonizingly against one another in the humid, suffocating spring air. If a man fainted from exhaustion, the sheer density of the crowd kept him standing upright. The fragile, intricate wooden skeleton of the Sultana groaned, creaked, and warped agonizingly under the immense, unnatural weight of 2,000 bodies. The ship was riding dangerously low in the water, her lower decks nearly kissing the cold, turbulent surface of the Mississippi. Yet, the suffocating overcrowding above the decks was nothing compared to the apocalyptic threat sleeping silently below them. Deep in the dark, sweltering, coal-dusted engine room, the true heart of the disaster was already failing. The Sultana was powered by 4 colossal tubular steam boilers, and one of them was severely, dangerously compromised. Under immense pressure, a seam in the central boiler had cracked, violently hissing and leaking steam into the dark hull. Standard engineering protocols demanded that the fires be entirely extinguished, the massive boiler drained, and the metal properly replaced by a skilled boilermaker. It was a mandatory safety delay that would take several days to complete. But Captain Mason, terrified that his highly lucrative human cargo would grow impatient and board a rival steamboat if delayed, absolutely refused to wait for a proper, safe repair. Greed is a demanding master. It has no patience for the meticulous, slow labor of safety. Instead of replacing the ruptured metal, Mason forced his chief engineer to hastily weld a thin, flimsy metal patch directly over the bulging, weakened seam of the massive boiler. It was a catastrophic compromise, a band-aid placed over a volcano. He knowingly placed 2,300 fragile lives directly on top of a hissing, compromised, and highly unstable explosive device. Human hubris had successfully created a terrifying floating paradox. The Sultana was a wooden prison of salvation, a vessel of hope powered by a ticking high-pressure time bomb. The date is April 27th, 1865. The time is approaching 2 o'clock in the cold, unforgiving morning. The Sultana is slowly cutting through the pitch-black waters of the Mississippi River a few miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. The river that spring was swollen with heavy floods. Snowmelt from the north had created a dark, icy, and treacherous current that swept violently downstream, carrying torn trees and debris in its wake. The night was cloaked in a chilling, freezing rain. On the exposed upper decks, the exhausted survivors of Andersonville huddled together, shivering uncontrollably in the dark, trying to steal a few moments of sleep while dreaming of the homes they were finally going to see. But down in the roaring, fiery belly of the ship, the laws of physics finally ran out of patience. The water levels inside the compromised boiler fluctuated wildly as the overloaded ship rolled from side to side in the heavy river current. Red-hot iron met sudden, surging cold water. The steam pressure inside the sealed metal chamber spiked exponentially in a matter of seconds. The thin, hasty, pathetic metal patch that Captain Mason had ordered could no longer contain the fury of the pressurized steam. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the illusion of safety shattered forever. The compromised boiler gave way. It was not merely an explosion, it was the sudden, catastrophic unleashing of hell on Earth. The central boiler detonated with a deafening, apocalyptic roar, instantly tearing through the heavy iron casings. The sheer kinetic force of the blast was so absolute, so incomprehensibly violent, that it instantly triggered the detonation of 2 adjacent boilers. In a fraction of a millisecond, the entire central section of the SS Sultana was entirely vaporized. A blinding, towering pillar of pure white-hot steam, boiling water, glowing coals, and jagged iron shrapnel erupted violently straight up through the crowded wooden decks. The destruction was surgical in its cruelty. Hundreds of sleeping soldiers, men who had miraculously survived years of starvation, bullets, and disease, were instantly incinerated in their sleep. They never even had the time to open their eyes or scream. They were simply erased from existence by a wall of 1,000-degree steam and roaring fire. The explosive shockwave ripped through the delicate wooden architecture of the ship, splintering the upper decks and violently launching hundreds of people into the pitch-black, freezing sky like broken dolls. The colossal twin smokestacks, weighing thousands of pounds, lost their structural support, and collapsed inward, crushing the life out of anyone trapped beneath the screaming, burning wood. Within seconds, the majestic floating palace had been reduced to a shattered, burning, floating graveyard. For those who miraculously survived the initial blast, the true nightmare was only just beginning. The explosion had shattered the hull, and aggressive, towering flames rapidly consumed the dry, painted wood of the remaining decks. The survivors found themselves trapped in a terrifying, inescapable paradox. Behind them was a roaring, blinding inferno that threatened to melt their flesh. Below them was the dark, icy, and violently churning abyss of the flooded Mississippi River, to burn alive or to drown in the freezing void. This was the horrific choice forced upon the heroes of a broken nation. Driven by pure primal panic, hundreds of men threw themselves into the pitch-black freezing water. But these were not healthy men. These were the weakened, emaciated ghosts of Andersonville. Their muscles were atrophied. Their lungs were weak. Most of them did not even know how to swim. As they hit the icy water, the shock to their fragile systems was absolute. The Mississippi River became a chaotic, swirling vortex of pure human terror. In the pitch-black darkness, illuminated only by the terrifying orange glow of the burning wreckage, thousands of men fought a losing battle against the current. Survival instincts mutated into brutal, tragic savagery. Drowning men, desperate for a single breath of air, violently grabbed onto anyone and anything near them. They climbed on top of their own comrades, pushing each other down into the icy depths in a futile, animalistic struggle to stay afloat. The agonizing screams of the drowning and the burning echoed across the empty, indifferent riverbanks, a symphony of suffering swallowed by the night. Those who managed to grab onto floating pieces of burning debris soon succumbed to severe hypothermia, their weakened bodies simply shutting down in the freezing water. They silently slipped beneath the black surface, claimed by the river just miles away from the safety of the shore. The blazing ruins of the SS Sultana drifted downstream for a few agonizing hours, a burning ghost ship illuminating the bodies of the dead that trailed in her wake. Eventually, the shattered, burning hull surrendered to the water, sinking into the dark, muddy bottom of the Mississippi. When the sun finally rose over the river the next morning, it illuminated a scene of unimaginable devastation. The mighty Mississippi was choked with the floating debris of human arrogance, splintered wood, charred military coats, and the lifeless bodies of those who had fought so hard to return home. The final death toll of the SS Sultana disaster is a mathematical monument to pure, preventable tragedy. An estimated 1,192 people lost their lives that night in the freezing waters and roaring flames. It is the greatest, most lethal maritime disaster in the entire history of the United States. Proportionally, the loss of life on the Sultana vastly exceeded the tragic sinking of the RMS Titanic decades later. Yet, if you ask the average person today about the Sultana, you will be met with a blank stare. How does a tragedy of this monumental, apocalyptic scale simply vanish from the collective memory of a nation? How do the agonizing screams of nearly 1,200 heroes fade into absolute obscurity? The answer lies in the cruel, chaotic timing of history and the fickle nature of human attention. In late April of 1865, the United States was entirely consumed by a different, much darker kind of grief. Just days before the Sultana exploded, President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated in Washington, D.C. The entire nation was paralyzed by the shock of losing their leader. The newspapers, the telegraph lines, and the public consciousness were entirely saturated with the hunt for his killer, John Wilkes Booth. When Booth was finally tracked down and killed on April 26th, the exact same day the Sultana departed Vicksburg, the media had no room left for another tragedy. The newspapers relegated the deaths of 1,192 soldiers to the back pages, a mere footnote buried beneath the monumental shadow of Lincoln's blood. A nation exhausted by 4 years of endless death simply could not process another mass casualty event. They turned their heads away, and the Sultana was quietly swept under the rug of history. No one was ever truly held accountable for the apocalyptic greed that destroyed the ship. Captain Mason went down with his vessel, taking the guilt of his arrogance to a watery grave. The military officials who turned a blind eye to the overcrowding in exchange for bribes faced minor reprimands, their crimes forgotten by a distracted government. Today, the remains of the SS Sultana do not rest in the deep, romantic isolation of the open ocean. Over the past century and a half, the mighty Mississippi River has dramatically shifted its course. The charred, shattered wooden bones of the great steamboat now lie buried deep beneath an ordinary muddy soybean field in Marion, Arkansas. Tractors drive over the silent graves of 1,200 men, completely unaware of the apocalyptic horror that slumbers just a few feet beneath the soil. It is a haunting physical reminder that the universe does not care about our survival, our struggles, or our desperate desires to return home. When human hubris pushes the rigid, emotionless boundaries of physics to their absolute breaking point, nature will inevitably and violently correct the balance. And it is always the innocent, the exhausted, and the vulnerable who pay the ultimate price for the greed of those in power. The SS Sultana remains the darkest, most tragic monument to industrial arrogance, swallowed by the cold mud and erased by the chaotic noise of history. But history is not dead. It is never dead. It merely slumbers beneath the muddy, flooded fields of our forgotten past, patiently waiting to be remembered by those willing to look into the dark. We will meet again in the next era, when humanity once more forgets the terrifying lessons written in steam, fire, and freezing water. You are watching Past Resurrected. Until the next era,